Well, looking at the numbers at this point in time, we are looking at the various moving pieces as the outcome of the general elections of 2024 are concerned. While those numbers are flashing on the screen, there is a lot happening behind the scenes. But the big question on the economic front is, how does this change India's economic growth story? Let's discuss this. The chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Bibek Debroy, joining us on the show. Great to have you, Mr. Debroy. While I know you've said in the recent past that India can grow at 7% annually for the next 5 years, today the worry, in some quarters at least, Mr. Debroy, is that the outcome of this election is going to affect the pace and the quantum of India's economic growth. Do you share that worry, looking at this electoral verdict so far?
No, I don't. I think one should distinguish between the macro fundamentals and unrealistic hype that was exemplified in the stock market, particularly triggered by the exit polls. That volatility has gone, but the macro fundamentals, be it in terms of the rate of growth, be it in terms of the broad-based nature of growth, be it in terms of the GST numbers, those remain. Now, obviously, this is going to be some kind of coalition government. The BJP numbers are not as good as was perhaps hoped. So there is a political exercise of managing the coalition. But insofar as the reforms are concerned, whatever be the definition of reforms, I don't expect the reform momentum to slow down. And therefore, I don't expect there to be any impact on the real rate of growth. There are issues concerning reform. Some of them concerns the states. They are somewhat independent of what the precise numbers are. The point I'm making is that the precise numbers are more important from the point of view of political management, less from the point of view of economic management.
Whether or not you consider the numbers in their entirety in your broad and deep understanding of the correlation between India's economic and political history, how have we done on the economic front when coalition politics takes center stage at the center?
Well, if you're going to talk about coalition politics, probably the government that will come foremost to mind is the Narasimha Rao government, which is identified with having introduced the reforms, which underlines the point that I made, that it is not quite the case that at the union government level, a coalition government depends a little bit on the numbers. The coalition government with perhaps the majority, the major political party having 160 seats is somewhat different. But in this particular case, the BJP seems to be headed towards something like 240. So I would argue that there is a difference between a coalition government where the BJP gets 240 and one where the BJP gets 160. So I do not think there is any reason to doubt the continuation of reforms just because of these numbers. Reforms always have a political economy, and that political economic question remains whether the BJP number is 240 or whether the BJP number is 273.
Mr. Debroy, in hindsight, when you look at reforms, land, labor, capital, as far as the current dispensation is concerned, how do you think it has fared? How much of this election verdict, for example, has been impacted by the jobs that the Indian economy has been able to generate in recent times? You have said India needs 8 million jobs a year. Now, the question is, can we still do it? And in terms of the reforms process, though there is a sense, like you're pointing out, that there will be continuity on that count, but there would be an impact in coalition kind of situation in the government.
Well, you are harping on the coalition at the union government level. But if you think of the product markets that you mentioned, land is completely a state subject. And linked to land is the question of agriculture, which by and large is a state subject. Labor is on the concurrent list, but something like the Shops and Establishments Act is completely in the state list. And the announcement of orders under the 4 new labor codes, that is also a state government subject. The point I'm making is, yes, there is a political economy issue. Yes, there is a question of union state. Yes, it is true that land and labor markets are not efficient and the reforms have not proceeded as fast as they should. All I'm questioning is the correlation or the attempted correlation between lack of reforms on those and the absence of presence of a coalition government within ports in Delhi.
Indeed, Mr. Debroy, but much of the outgoing government's political rhetoric, even if you have paid attention to, has focused on the importance of a double-engine sarkar, to have the same political party at the center and the state to work in unison for greater progress. From sheer economics, how much has it helped? And if that gets compromised, how much does it hurt growth?
No, it depends on the state government, because the elections that we have just had are for parliament. There are state governments which are BJP-led, there are state governments which are non-BJP-led. And the driving impetus behind what has happened since 2014 is the delivery of what has been called basic necessities. And whichever yardstick you use, there is no question that India as a whole, deprived, disadvantaged sections as a whole, are better off today. And remember, the second Narendra Modi government happened to be one which was affected badly by COVID and the aftermath of COVID.
Mr. Debroy, if the economy has pegged its hopes on driving up consumption, if that's what brings in the FDI too, with the promise of the Indian consumption story, then what do you see the next government try and do to push up consumption? How much maneuverability do you see in lowering of taxes? Will that be the ask of the next government, you think?
Tax reform, you use the expression lowering of taxes. I would use the expression tax reform, because so far as GST is concerned, it's under the purview of the GST Council, and it continues to remain under the purview of the GST Council. So far as the direct taxes are concerned, there is a direct tax code which will involve the removal of exemptions. Now, this does not mean that on the direct tax side, the average tax rate will come down. That I don't think necessarily follows. What does follow is that the system will become simpler. What does follow is that the compliance costs will be less, so on and so forth. So I think a large part of the template will be laid out in the next budget, which will emphasize fiscal consolidation and tax reform, because those are clearly union government subjects. And I deliberately mentioned fiscal consolidation because, as you rightly said, you didn't exactly use this expression, but as you rightly said, there are four main drivers of growth: consumption, government expenditure, private investments, and net exports. The external world, we know, is not that kind, and there are limits to capital expenditure by union government, remembering, of course, that capital expenditure also happens by state governments. So the primary engines for growth will have to be consumption and private investments. We can quibble about the numbers, but I happen to think that there are early signs of both of these reviving. And it's just a matter of time before we will see both private consumption and private investment picking up.
Private investment, because we saw the kind of fallout of the election verdict in the markets. When you look at the possibility of private capex picking up, which has been lagging, government spending has been leading the charge, as it were, especially when it comes to infrastructure. How is that scenario likely to change in terms of outlays within the budget, in terms of the government's disinvestment plans as well? How much maneuverability do you think the next government would have?
You see, disinvestment has not quite happened under the second Narendra Modi government. Instead, it's the national monetization pipeline, which is somewhat different from privatization or disinvestment. The progress of the national monetization pipeline varies from sector to sector. It has been more marked. The success has been more marked in national highways, less marked in railways. So I would say this is one of the major agenda items, because I mentioned fiscal consolidation. Within fiscal consolidation, you have expenditure and you have revenue of the tax kind, direct as well as non-tax, and you have other kinds of receipts in which you have privatization, disinvestment, and monetization of public assets. So I would argue, or I would hope that these will be major agenda items in the new budget.
Also, as far as the entire debate around this election has been about how much the Constitution is at risk. At least the opposition's charge has been that. I know that in the past you've said that much of what we debate begins and ends with the Constitution. A few amendments will not do. We should go back, you've said, to the drawing board and start from first principles, asking what these words in the preamble mean now. Socialist, secular, democratic, justice, liberty, and equality. And you've said that we, the people, have to give ourselves a new constitution. Mr. Debroy, in light of the kind of verdict that we are seeing today and what you have said in the past, how do you think this has a bearing in today's context when we are looking at the formation of the next government?
That article, and if you're quoting that article, you should quote that article in its entirety, in its context. That article was not about, it was written last year, it was not about 2023. It was looking forward to 2047. 2047 is a long way off. And by the time it comes to 2047, I think a lot of things in our polity we will have to rethink, not just what you just flagged. So far as the present electoral results are concerned, I am inclined to think, although I'm not a political scientist, that what has happened should not be judged on the basis of some all-India hypothesis. Instead, I think what has happened is an aggregate of what has happened in different states. And that has led to the kind of results we have today. So I do not think there is a binary answer as to what has determined these results.
Also, Mr. Debroy, the fact that rural India seems to have voted against the current dispensation, what do you put that down to? Is this about rural distress? Is this about growth and development not being even when you do the rural-urban kind of comparison?
At this stage, I would be very reluctant to accept a hypothesis that says rural India has voted against the present government. Because until the results are out, until the results are analyzed, I would be very reluctant to accept that hypothesis, particularly because if we want to look at India, I think we should cease to look at it in terms of a rural-urban lens, although urban clearly has a census definition. Since 2014, any number of dashboards, any number of independent studies have showed that it is particularly rural India, accepting the definition of rural, that has benefited the most from basic necessities. If there is an unemployment problem, and there are problems with measuring employment and unemployment, it is fundamentally concentrated in urban India. If that is the case, the proposition, the hypothesis that you are propounding does not ab initio sound very logical. But all I would say is that let us wait to find out the detailed data before we begin to jump to hasty generalizations.
Indeed, if rural India, and going by your own definition of rural India, if that has to be better served by the next government, how do you think it would have to be done?
Well, I think, there are two things on which we need some kind of identity. There is one on which it has nothing to do with your question, but I think we need some kind of an legal identity for MSME enterprise. MSME enterprise, as you know, does not need to be formally legally registered, and MSME is largely informal. We need some kind of legal identity for MSME. In all probability, that can be the GSTN number. The second aspect of identity, which is linked to the question that you are asking, is the identity of individuals. Now, you will say, of course, we have JAM. Of course, we have financial inclusion. Of course, we have mobile numbers. We also have Aadhaar numbers. But the point I'm making that some aspects of welfare are linked not to individuals, but to households. MGNREGS is one example of that, but there are others. So we will have to figure out a way of matching individual identity with identities of households, spliced with the fact that the SECC database, which has been used for rural India, is very old. It needs to be updated. So I would think that from the development and governance point of view, there are two more important questions in addition to the ones I mentioned. One is the identity for MSME, and the second one is an improved identity for individuals and or households.
Well, from the future point of view, all of this is going to be at play. But from a near-term perspective, there is going to be the budget, and a lot of hopes are pegged in terms of the direction that the Indian economy is likely to take. We know of the big RBI payout of dividend to the government, and perhaps that gives the next government a good starting point, and we'll see how much of that helps. But Mr. Debroy, it's really a pleasure getting in your perspective at this stage. Thanks indeed for joining us on this edition of our Battleground 2024 coverage. Thanks indeed.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.